North American Soccer League Players Association strike goes on, having trouble tonight. Many of the teams without its regulars. Now, in the wake of the strike, here's how one NASL team, the Rochester Lancers, prepared for its game against Tulsa.
Rochester Lancers chairman of the board and part owner, Charlie Schiano, spent the last few minutes before the flight to Tulsa checking on players the club hastily recruited for tonight's game against the Roughnecks. Only 2 regular team members reported to the airport. The rest of the squad was completed with amateurs and former NASL players, including former Washington Diplomats and New York Cosmos goalie Kurt Kuykendall. Lancers coach Dragan Don Popovich was not optimistic about the strike or the game.
I'm really between the owners and the players. I sympathize both sides. I think the players fighting for their side of the story, and the owners is hurt because they're losing too much money already right now. And I'm just between. I'm the coach. I have to run the team. If they want me to be in Tulsa, I'll be there.
One of those who joined the strike is star goalie Shep Messing, the former Cosmos goalie, who recently signed a $125,000 contract with Rochester.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
I thank you, Corey Coates, and I thank you out there in podcast listener land. My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast that is focused on what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate to no end you going out of your way to find us and download us and listen to us. And hopefully this week we'll keep you interested and entertained and maybe even a little education along the way. God forbid, as we get back into the old North American Soccer League, and we're going to dial that Wayback Machine to just about 40 years ago this week. In 1979, NASL, and we're going to talk about a very interesting and oft-forgotten little speed bump in the history of that league with our return guest, Steve Holroyd. And it was basically the NASL players going on strike. Well, sort of. And we'll get into that with Steve in a couple of seconds. Against the ownership of the North American Soccer League, which at the time, the league was very much not only in its ascendance, but arguably near its zenith in terms of its influence, its growth, its power, if you will, in the American sports landscape. I mean, this is a league that was near death's doorstep in 1971-72. It was just a handful of teams, and through sheer will, as we've explored in other conversations, of people like Phil Woosnam and other players and owners that saw more future for this league than death. And what a reward in the 7 or 8 years since then, because circa 1979, you had a league that was now in 24 major markets across the United States and in Canada. You had a league that now finally had another long-term, or at least supposedly was going to be a long-term, national broadcast television contract with ABC. You had gigantic crowds in lots of different places. New York, of course, prime among them by selling out Giant Stadium on a somewhat regular basis, but also large crowds in places like Tampa Bay and Seattle and Minnesota, just a whole bunch of places. I mean, you could make the argument in 78, 79 that the North American Soccer League had indeed arrived on the national professional sports scene. And many things seem to be going all its way, for sure. But we're going to get into one of the little speed bumps that, maybe was maybe the first real sort of piece of evidence that maybe this North American Soccer League outdoor extravaganza was not long for this life. Certainly, there were a lot of other things that conspired to ultimately end the NASL's existence at the end of the 1984 season. By the way, plenty of episodes in our library at goodseatsstillavailable.com to go into all of those things, and there will be plenty more, I assure you. But one of those that really kind of broke into the open is what our conversation with Steve Holroyd is going to be about, and that is the strike by the players of the NASL against the owners of said league. And I think, not only was it an interesting and somewhat weakened job action, as we'll get into, it was also, though, really kind of the first sort of real, I think, mainstream understanding of perhaps the somewhat shaky underpinnings of what this league was all about, despite all of its rapid growth. I mean, you can't grow as rapidly as the NASL did without sort of realities catching up. And we're going to get into some of the various interesting stories and idiosyncrasies, the way this strike played out. And I think importantly, how this issue of labor relations continues to be a very relevant topic and unavoidable discussion and issue, not only in pro sports generally, but soccer specifically. You may remember in 2015, Major League Soccer had a fit and start with labor relations. And MLS is probably going to go through the same again once the 2019 season is over. So in many respects, everything old is new again. It'll be very interesting, especially given how MLS itself has grown. I think we're now approaching, 28 now franchises in Major League Soccer? Yes, it's still single entity. But there is major debate. I mean, there's not a week that goes by on Twitter or in these other social media fora that there's a discussion about how healthy Major League Soccer really is. How many teams are profitable? Attendance, certainly in the early part of the spring of this season, not great. If you look at the actual pictures and the broadcasts, a lot of empty seats out there. Yet, you've got brand new stadiums coming up in Minnesota and some great crowds and sellouts in places like Portland and I mean, it's sort of a hit or miss, up and down kind of, success story. And there's no argument that MLS has been successful. The fact that it's been around for, 20 years and some to bring and establish and root professional soccer in this country. But it'll be very interesting to sort of see how the economics come out in this next round of labor conversations that come up after this season. But, let's prepare for all of that with our great conversation with our return guest, Steve Holroyd, coming up, talking about the old North American Soccer League strike and the things that came from that, both immediately as well as now, perhaps in the months to come with today's version of pro soccer in the United States in just a few seconds. So please stay tuned for that. You're going to learn a lot, as I did. And we appreciate your doing so. And we also appreciate you trying all of our great sponsors. And this week, I just want to quickly highlight our friends at Audible. And if you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, you're going to get a chance to taste and enjoy the magic that is audiobooks. And if you've never tried an audiobook, this is a tremendous way to do so. It's basically a no-risk proposition, because if you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, he says, you're going to get one free audiobook download to enjoy for the life of your device. So even if you cancel, which you can do at any time, it is yours to keep, that audiobook, as long as your device lives. And why not? I mean, again, it's a risk-free proposition, and there are over, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of titles to choose from. And if you love soccer, which I would imagine a lot of our listeners this week do, there are a couple of great books there. There's tons of them, but I'm going to just call out two that might be a great way to burn that credit that you get by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats. One is our great friend, although he doesn't know it because we never really met before. Actually, that's not true. I actually met him when I was a kid. He, of course, wouldn't remember, but his name is Pele. And we hope he's doing well. We know he had a little health scare a couple of weeks ago while traveling in Paris. But his autobiography, or his second autobiography, it's called Pele, Why Soccer Matters. And it's written in conjunction with Brian Winter, and it is narrated by Sean Pratt. It gets into Pele's story, his history, and frankly, a bit of a treatise on why soccer, not only important to him, but also important to sports in general. You can use your credit for that book. But if you don't want to do that, well, why not use your credit for the Men in Blazers Encyclopedia Blazertanica. Yeah, you say that 3 times fast. The Suboptimal Guide to Soccer, America's Sport of the Future since 1972. And not only is it written by Michael Davies and Ryan, the guys from the Men in Blazers podcast, but it is narrated by them. Roger Bennett and Michael Davies narrate their audiobook. I'll put audiobook in quotes for that because it's almost like listening into their show for an extended, almost 4-hour period of time. And it is a hoot. It is a blast. And again, that's Men in Blazers' Encyclopedia Blazertanica. And you can use your credit at audibletrial.com/goodseats for that book if you want, for God's sakes. And again, it's not just soccer, but there's tons and tons and tons of other genres, nonfiction and fiction, you name it. There are hundreds, literally, of thousands, literally, of titles to choose from at Audible. And that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. Get your free download. Enjoy the audiobook experience. Again, cancel at any time. And by doing so, you will give a few shekels of love to your favorite wink, wink, nod, nod podcast here at Good Seats Still Available. All right, so I am not going to waste any more time. We're going to slide nice and smoothly into our very entertaining and interesting conversation with Steve Holroyd as we get into the various intricacies of the North American Soccer League players' strike. Or was it, really, back in 1979? And here's our conversation coming up. Why don't you remind our audience, Steve, who you are, what you do as your day job, which I think ironically qualifies you for the grist for our conversation this afternoon.
Yes, my name is Steve Holroyd. I am currently a director with the Society for American Soccer History. I've been researching and writing about soccer history for about the past 25 years, and I've been collecting and documenting it even long before that. My day job, which, as you noted, dovetails nicely into today's topic, is I am a labor attorney in Philadelphia representing unions with the firm of Jennings Sigmund. I've been doing that for 21 years, 22 years now, and the 7 years prior to that, I worked with the National Labor Relations Board, which is another party which will figure rather prominently in today's discussion.
Absolutely. Well, what we're kind of leading up to is that by the time this airs, you will have published a piece that harkens back to a time in the North American Soccer League's existence, in particular, specifically the season being 1979. Now, this is, as a scene set, we might want to kind of start with a bit of sort of where the NASL was in terms of its success arc, given that, the league had obviously sort of seen its ghosts in the earlier part of the decade. You want to kind of just give our audience a bit of a hint of sort of what this league was circa 1978 heading into the beginning of the 1979 season. You could make the argument that if it wasn't at its apex, it was certainly near that sort of zone of its greatest success in its history at that point.
Right, I would agree. I mean, 79 was, if it was not the apex, but it was just 1 year shy. I think 1980 was the peak. But, it was certainly on an upswing. As I think most of your listeners know, the league basically started in 1968 after the merger of two competing leagues the season before. It almost immediately collapsed. It survived into 1969 with 5 teams, and then slowly built its way back up until we get to 1978, when, after a very successful 1977 season, highlighted mostly by Pele's swan song and a Cosmos championship, and crowds of 77,000 piling into the Giant Stadium, you were probably there for that. The league expanded by 6 teams to an all-time high of 24. And in 1979, the league accomplished something that it had not accomplished in any prior year. All of the teams returned, all of the 24 teams returned for the 1979 season, with only one relocation. Colorado moved to Atlanta. Otherwise, all the other teams stayed the same. So, yeah, it was riding at it was on a peak. That was the first year of a much ballyhooed national TV contract with ABC. So, everyone was looking at happy days ahead.
Yeah, 78 was the second sort of consecutive championship of the New York Cosmos. You can make the argument that 78 was probably the perfect season for the Cosmos on many different levels. And going into 79, Phil Woosnam was riding high for sure, not only with the fact that you had 24 teams and had come from so far down, just not even 10 years prior, with a brand new spanking network, broadcast television network contract in hand. And it could not have seemed to be anything more than happier days ahead as this league was continuing, at least on its surface, to grow and to get to that next level of sort of national sports consciousness. But maybe you could help sort of give us a little bit of a background or understanding of what, at least on the labor relations side, the players and owners relationship was sort of, brewing around that time, even before we get to the actual strike action itself. There was this, and there are various players involved here, people involved, right? So maybe a little bit of also understanding that this wasn't the only sort of sport in the U.S. that was going through a series of sort of labor disputes and consternation.
Yeah, by the 1970s, players had realized the value of unionization. It was a concept that even though in the United States it was basically accepted and essentially made lawful in 1935, in that prior to that, if you were in a union, employers would challenge you as an antitrust cartel, subject to the Sherman Act. In 1935, the U.S. Congress finally resolved that in favor of unions and labor organizations. Employees could bargain for their mutual aid and protection. But in sports, players were rather slow to embrace the concept, and it's understandable. I mean, you're signing individual contracts. Culturally, it tended to be kind of an every man for himself type of situation. I'm as good. If I'm good, the owner will pay me. If I'm not good, I get cut. Why do I need a union? But by the 1970s, between issues with free agency, or not free agency, the reserve clause, players were really beginning to chafe against the reserve clause. But more importantly, something as simple as a pension. Players had finally come to realize, I don't play forever. These owners make a lot of money on my efforts and my skill and ability, and yet when I retire, I have nothing. So initially, a lot of these unions were formed simply to try to get the employers to sit at the table and bargain a pension, and there was some success there in the NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball. Owners could see the value of the pension. It didn't really cost all that much. But then players were starting to take the next step, challenging the reserve clause, trying to get certain other benefits, medical coverage, guaranteed contracts, things like that. And the owners really chafed against that sort of unionization. So you saw, strikes in baseball. I think 72 was the first strike. There may have been another one after that. There was a strike in the NFL in 75, I believe, 74, because it helped the WFL get started, the World Football League, and the players' union in the NBA was holding up the merger between the NBA and the ABA because of antitrust issues. Unions were just getting more involved in the world of professional sports, and we were talking about the growth of the North American Soccer League. Owners certainly saw potential owners certainly saw the upswing of the sport in 1977, and they weren't alone. I mean, that's in the summer of 1977 was when the players, particularly an ex-player named John Kerr, who was a Scottish-born Canadian international who starred with the early pre-Pele Cosmos, was retired by then. But he and I guess some other players realized, we're at the ground floor of something big. It would be a good idea to get together and unionize now, so we have a seat at the table as this sport grows, as opposed to what happened in all the other sports. Basically all the money goes out the door. We don't see much of it, and then by the time we get involved, it's too late. So it was in the summer of 1977 that what became the North American Soccer League Players Association formed.
So, yeah, that's a good point in time. I'm just curious as to, was that sort of the first 77, the first sort of real formal approach to creating a players association, or had some of the players kind of thought about or at least explored that idea previously, or was this sort of gelling because of the Pele era and all that stuff?
Yeah, I was doing some checking. I thought in some of my prior research that I caught references to a planned union in 1968, which of course it was moot when there was the collapse of about 17 franchises. But as far as I could tell, no. I mean, the league was such a year-to-year proposition that there was no real. You didn't see a whole lot of talk or interest in unionization. I'm sure the first seeds probably started. I mean, probably when Pele arrived was when people would first start thinking about it. But as near as I can tell, the first concrete steps to actually form an organization and get it done took place during the 1977 season.
Well, in some respects, you could also, make the argument that this is sort of the ultimate invalidation, I guess, of the North American Soccer League, right? In that if you've got a players' union at least being seriously talked about, let alone beginning to be formed, right? That arguably is in some backhanded way a piece of evidence that, the sport of soccer on the professional level had finally, quote unquote, made it. But I guess what I'd be really curious to sort of understand is what were the key sort of issues, I guess, that the players kind of felt that they needed to unionize around. From what I can tell, and you're clearly the expert in this discussion, that it wasn't necessarily just about money, although money certainly has a role to play in a lot of these things. But that almost didn't seem to be almost like the primary issue that sort of unionized or brought them together to discuss unionization.
No, you're right. It wasn't just money, although clearly bumping up the minimum salaries and things like that are always on the table. No, it was things like in the North American Soccer League, it appears one of the big issues that players really chafed over was the rather random nature in which players would be placed on waivers or traded. Just the trade, although trades are nothing new in sports, for some reason in soccer, and perhaps it was the presence of foreign players who were used to having a lot more say in where they were transferred and getting a piece of the pie when they were transferred, to coming to America where really you were a piece of property, which is the way it had always been with athletes in all the sports. They had a contract, you were a piece of property that could be moved at the whim of the employer. It was things like that they were really looking to address. Guaranteed contracts. They wanted to. If I sign the contract, I want to be able to budget my life and understand that I'm going to receive a full year's pay and not simply be cut on a whim and now I'm unemployed with nothing. I suppose long term, like anything else, it would be pension concerns, although that doesn't seem to be, it didn't seem to be on the front burner by the time the parties finally got to the table, basically 3.5 years after the whole thing started. Which is the real story we're going to be talking about, what a mess that was. But no, it really was I guess you could call quality of life. A lot of it was more quality of life issues than trying to soak the owners for every cent they could get.
Was some of this, and we'll get to sort of the formation and the mechanics in a minute, but was some of this born from, for lack of a better description, maybe sort of a perceived two-class system, right? You had all these foreign imports, many of whom were simply being loaned to play in the United States and the North American Soccer League. It almost feels with gigantic salaries, i.e. named players, Pele being sort of prime among them, versus, say, let's call them rank and file of the North American player, right, which, have been protected by the rules to at least have some a guarantee of how many players on the field, but arguably was not even close to some of the astronomical salaries that some of these foreign players were making for just showing up, frankly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, that was a real sticking point. I recall, even though I haven't read the book in probably about 40 years, I did read Shep Messing's memoir a couple times when I was a kid. And I remember even there, one of the big takeaways he was talking about, and this is in the pre-Pele era, about how he and Len Ranieri and Stan Startzel would be practicing in the day and then have to go work as, I think Shep was working at a catering hall. They'd work all night long. And then they went and visited some third division loan players from England, and they see they're hanging by the pool, suntan lotion, beers in hand, just enjoying life. And they realized, what's wrong with this picture? I think Bobby Smith alluded to a little bit of it in his interview with you about, he's working on construction sites during the day, practicing soccer at night. And then, and then some other players are coming over. The foreign players are coming over, and they're getting full salaries, and they don't have to do that. And yeah, there were two classes. And so as a result, certainly it was the permanent players, obviously, the ones who are here full time, American naturalized foreign residents, international residents who had stayed, who found themselves on the receiving end of that, as opposed to the lone players who came over here, it was a paid vacation and went home. And yeah, and those two worlds were starting to collide, and I think the more permanent players who really made up the backbone of this league felt it was time to try to address those issues.
All right, so how does the concept of unionizing go from idea and chatter into reality? Because it seems to me like that this character, Ed Garvey, comes into play, and having had some success in other sports, was looked upon perhaps as sort of the guy who could make this happen in the NASL as well.
Yes, I mean, under the law, any group of employees, 2 or more people, can decide they want to band together for the legal phrases for their mutual aid and protection and form a labor organization. That's the legal term. It doesn't have to be an already existing union. It doesn't have to be one of the brands like Teamsters. You can form your own union, give it your own name, and there's a process. And the first step in the process is getting a showing of interest from the employees, basically getting cards signed from the employees saying that, hey, I want to authorize this organization, whatever you call it, to be my exclusive bargaining agent for the purposes of wages, negotiating wages, hours, and working conditions. In 1977, John Kerr, whose last team was the Washington Diplomats and was in the Washington area, I guess had this idea and had at some point had come across Ed Garvey, who was serving as the executive director for the National Football League Players Association. The NFLPA authorized Mr. Garvey to assist Kerr and soccer players in forming their own union and assist not only with Mr. Garvey's expertise, but also with money that would be repaid when the NASLPA, the North American Soccer League Players Association, which is the name they ultimately chose for themselves, would start getting dues and licensing revenues and stuff that could pay the NFLPA back. And they started working on getting cards signed. And by July of 1977, about approximately 300 players had signed authorization cards. And when you hit that stage, you can do 2 things. You can go to the employer directly and say, hey, employer, I'm the union. I have cards signed by a majority of the employees. It doesn't have to be everybody. It just has to be a majority authorizing me to be their representative. Will you recognize me? And the employer can either say yes, and then you're off to the races in bargaining, or the employer can say no, and then there's another step. Alternatively, you can skip seeking recognition and just go right to that other step, which is what the NASLPA did here. They filed a petition with the National Labor Relations Board, the federal agency that's charged with monitoring and enforcing our nation's labor laws, August 16, 1977, seeking certification. And even at that stage, and I used to handle these petitions when I worked at the board, when the petition's filed, the employer is still free to voluntarily recognize. Most don't, because they say, look, let's have an election. But typically the process is pretty smooth. Everyone understands, okay, like in your average factory setting, all right, I'm looking to represent the truck drivers. Everyone agrees, okay, there's only one set of truck drivers in this facility, and they clearly share what's called the community of interest. You know, their interests and concerns are alike enough that they belong together, as opposed to wedging in secretaries or another group that has a totally different set of interests. And everyone agrees, okay, yeah, it's an appropriate unit. The union's okay. It's a legitimate labor organization. Let's have the election. The North American Soccer League chose not to do that, and that's what resulted in what wound up being a almost 3.5-year fight that in the end helped neither side, and along the way led to a strike in 1979.
So my understanding is that the concept of forming the union, so this was about a year plus, was it August of 77 or so, maybe it was sort of one of the first sort of concept about voting to unionize kind of came into play. So why that approach then of the 2 that you just outlined? Why that versus the other path, right? Was it determined was that more of a strategic bet that it would force the owner's hand or the issue more forcefully or more to their liking? Was it a calculated bet? Was it just on a whim to go in this direction? Give the layman a little bit of a sense of why this was the path.
Yeah, I mean, I think, having representing clients now that continue to organize, basically no one voluntarily recognizes anyone anymore. It's a wasted step. So I think it was simply, look, we're going to have to go to the board one way or the other. Why waste time? Let's do it. Also, the concept of involuntarily organizing or getting recognized in sports was still relatively new. The NFLPA had been certified by the NLRB a few years earlier. The other unions were all voluntarily recognized simply because when they started out, they were innocuous enough that the owners said, yeah, we have nothing to lose. Why not? By 1977, the owners' leagues have started to realize, hey, unions can be a threat. So no, I think it was simply, look, let's get to it. I mean, we're going to be fought here. There are going to be issues that probably need to be litigated. So rather than going through the publicity exercise of requesting voluntary recognition, let's just file with the NLRB and get the process started so we can get to the finish line, which is being certified as the bargaining representative as quickly as possible.
So Ed Garvey was also the executive director of the NFL's Player Association, right? So I guess there had to be some thinking that he was the guy with the juice, so to speak, to kind of make the NASL's case forcefully. I mean, was there any discussion or why Garvey? Was it because of that, or you could also make the argument that some of the owners of the NASL also were NFL owners? I guess the thought was that, what better way to get people's attention to how serious we are than by having the guy who basically has been kicking the butt of the NFL over the last number of years?
Yeah, I think it was all the above. I mean, first, Garvey did have experience, which counts for a lot. And yes, as you pointed out, of the NASL, there was a fair amount of cross-pollination with the NFL among the owners, particularly the one titan in the NASL, Lamar Hunt, owner of the Dallas Tornado. He also owned the Kansas City Chiefs. The Robbie family, who owned the Miami Dolphins, were owners of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. And so I'm sure there was some feeling that, hey, Garvey deals with these people, so why try to start over by bringing in, say, someone like me? Oh, he's a labor attorney, but he doesn't know any of the owners. Why start from scratch? Let's bring in Garvey. Part of it might have been, Garvey himself saying, hey, I'm the man for the job, and sort of convincing these players. The unfortunate, whether intended or otherwise, one of the unfortunate consequences is that Garvey's presence and the looming presence of the NFLPA in the background, was a problem. It was perhaps needlessly antagonistic towards the owners, who probably were nervous that the NASLPA offices were in the NFLPA's offices, and they were sharing the same staff. And indeed, when Garvey did send a demand for recognition over on August 29th, which was of 1977, which was after the petition had been filed, he sent it over on NFLPA letterhead. So if there were owners in the NASL who were worried about continuing NFL influence, Garvey's presence couldn't have helped. Because remember, in what would be a later lawsuit involving the owners, the NFL at this time is trying to pass rules prohibiting its owners from owning any other teams in what was seen as a clear attack at the North American Soccer League. The NFL didn't necessarily like the NASL, and the owners, I think there was a fair amount of concern on the owners' part that while, even though this is a union, this is the NFL's union, this is really, it's going to be a mole. It's just going to be another weapon used to put our league out of business. And so Garvey's presence did not make the process any smoother or any easier. And along the way, it could be fairly said, Garvey kind of inserted himself too much into the process. He didn't help. It's not like John Kerr, the ex-player, was doing most of the talking. It was Garvey going to the media. It was Garvey at the NLRB hearings. And if there was any thought that, hey, maybe we should put the owners' minds at ease. This is a soccer union. We're here for the good of the game. We're here to be a partner that was never conveyed with Garvey looming large and waving the NFLPA flag at numerous opportunities.
So it seems like 1978 this was kind of full of sort of subterfuge and intrigue behind the scenes. I mean, I think the average American soccer fan, NASL follower, was kind of unaware of most of this stuff. But what of 78? I mean, this was basically when, the Players Association had finally organized, and 78 was really when the National Labor Relations Board certified it. From your research, were you able to sort of glean maybe what was going on now that those two things had been done with respect to the owners and or Phil Woosnam as commissioner? Were there formal meetings to basically say, hey, please recognize us, and they were rebuffed, or any sort of anecdotes or sort of stories maybe about like how this attempt to get recognized went about in 78, because clearly it didn't yield any fruit?
Well, in 77 and 78, basically, during this period, the process is working. The labor board's doing its job. I mean, the NASLPA did all it could do at that point. It claimed it had a majority, and it filed its petition for representation. Now, because of some unique issues that, in fairness to the NASL, probably needed to be raised, the matter of whether the union was an appropriate union and whether the bargaining unit was an appropriate bargaining unit had to be litigated. So in September, early September of 1977, the parties had a hearing before hearing officer Richard Ross in New York to put the evidence on the table. And basically, the NASL is raising three issues essentially. Let me take a step back. In order to have an election, the labor board needs to check off certain boxes. One, the employer has to be engaged in interstate commerce. Well, the NASL clearly applies there. Two, the labor organization must be a legitimate labor organization. That is, that it's there for the purpose of representing employees. That box needs to be checked. And the third box is that there is a sufficient showing of interest, that there's a sufficient number of people authorizing the union to be its representative to warrant having the process of an election. And you only need 30% for that, as it is, again, the NASL went in with a majority. And the fourth box is whether the bargaining unit is appropriate. The law, again, there's this concept of community of interest. You're not going to wedge janitors and doctors together in a bargaining unit, because what one group cares about when it comes to wages and working conditions is much different than what another group cares about. And so the board has to look at that. At the hearing, the NASL clearly admitted it was engaged in commerce and couldn't really challenge the showing of interest. So they raised two big issues. One, they were asserting that the NASLPA wasn't a real labor organization for two reasons. One, because of its affiliation with the NFLPA, and two, because at that point it had already started hosting soccer camps and things like that, and sponsoring some indoor tournaments. So the NASL was trying to say, well, it's actually a competitor. It's a competitor employer now. It's not a union, so it can't be a labor organization. But most of the arguments centered on the bargaining unit. The union petitioned for a league-wide unit. All the teams, in the league. The league said, no, that's inappropriate. It should be individual teams. Basically, the union should have to bargain with each team. The players on each individual team should be able to have a say whether they want to be union or not. And as a result, instead of one unit, there should be this is in 77, so I think it was 18 teams, I guess. There should be 18 separate elections, 18 separate units, and ultimately 18 separate contracts. Not a ridiculous concept, because, again, in the real world with factories and things like that, there are certain presumptions. The board tends to look at single location units as being presumptively appropriate. Of course, the board also looks at what the petitioner wants, what the union wants, as far as being the unit being presumptively appropriate. And with any presumption, it can be rebutted. So that's what the board had to make a record to determine, get the evidence and determine how are we going to determine this. And that hearing was done September 8th and 9th of 77. because of the importance of the case. Typically, the region, it was done in Manhattan, in Region 2 of the board in Manhattan. Typically, the region issues a decision and it can be appealed. This case was so important, it was immediately transferred to the full board in September of 1977. And at that point, the parties are waiting on a decision. So that being the case, there's not a whole lot of fire and brimstone going on. The players aren't demanding bargaining because there's been no election yet. They haven't had an election. They can't prove they're the majority representative. At the same time, the owners, their hands are a little bit tied more than most because since there's an allegation that there's a union in the way, they have to try to maintain the status quo as much as possible. They can't go and start raising the minimum salary or changing roster sizes. They can't change terms and conditions of employment because they have to keep the status quo as much as possible. But for the most part, everyone's laying low, and the board, for its part, was wrestling with the issues here because the issues were legitimate. It wasn't the NASL necessarily being argumentative simply for the sake of being argumentative, and it wasn't until June 30 of 1978 that the board finally issues a decision and determines that a league-wide unit is appropriate, that the players' union is appropriate, notwithstanding its connections to the NFLPA. But it does, interestingly, say, but we can't include the Canadian teams because as a U.S. agency, we really don't have any jurisdiction over the Canadian teams, which at that point was Toronto, Vancouver. There might have just been Toronto and Vancouver at that point. Calgary wasn't there yet. Montreal wasn't there yet. So, yeah, it was the two teams, but they couldn't exercise jurisdiction over that. So, but the key was, the NASLPA won. There was an election held finally, August of 1978. The union wins 271-94. And the regional director for Region 2 issues a certification of representatives September 1st, 1978. At that point, the union is the certified collective bargaining representative. In normal circumstances, September 1, 1978 is the point where, okay, we won, you have to bargain with us now. And that's what you would typically see in the real world. And indeed, on September 12th, I think, the NASLPA sends over its letter formally requesting bargaining and also sends a letter requesting certain information about the salaries paid in the bargain unit, waiver history, typical stuff that, and again, any new union would ask for in anticipation of negotiations. The problem is there's a legal quirk. It's an administrative law quirk. The NASL wants to appeal the determination that the bargaining unit's appropriate, but it's not allowed to appeal the board's decision on the petition. It can't do that. The only way it can get the matter into the courts is by a procedure that's called test of cert, cert being certification. And that's where you deliberately say, I'm not bargaining with you. I'm deliberately going to violate the law. So there will be a board decision saying I'm violating the law, but then I can get that decision into the circuit courts, into the federal courts, out of the administrative process, the board, which is administrative law, and into the courts for full judicial review. It's the only way you can do that, and that's what the NASL determined to do. So from the very start, the NASL deliberately, not so much out of malice, but out of a sense of trying to exhaust its remedies as far as getting a judicial review of the underlying decision concerning the bargaining unit, told the NASLPA, we're not bargaining with you. And so on October 30th, 78, the NASLPA files unfair labor practice charges with the NLRB alleging refusal to bargain and the refusal to provide information. And at this point, the process moves fairly quickly. November 24th of 78, the NLRB issues a complaint. January 23rd of 79, the board issues an amended complaint because in order for the test of cert process to work, you need to have uncontested facts. And since with the information request, there's always different factual issues. Basically, the players union agreed to drop those charges and just go on the refusal to meet and bargain charges. So on January 23rd of 79, an amended complaint saying just that is issued. February 2nd, 1979, a motion for summary judgment's filed, and that's what's pending. So it's now early 1979. The test of cert is well along. It's now sitting before the NLRB in the first instance about whether the league is breaking the law, but the matter is sitting. And it's by now, February 79, that I guess the players have decided, it's been 18 months and we're still at this stage. We won an election. We still can't get anyone to bargain with us. The legal process can be a long, drawn-out thing. The players start thinking, okay, maybe we should rattle our sabers a little bit and start seeing if we can incentivize the owners to get to the table. And that's when you start hearing, at the beginning of the 1979 season, talk of the strike.
All right, we're going to take a quick, brief pause, and we want to remind you that our friends at Audible are offering to you, our listeners, an opportunity to get a free audiobook download from their amazing array of over 190,000 titles to choose from. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, and that's the place to go to get your free audiobook download, courtesy of us and Audible. And it's something you can cancel at any time, and you can keep the book for as long as your device exists. And like I said before, there's just a ton of choices available to you to burn up that free credit, including a bunch in the realm of our forgotten sports little genre here, including in the realm of basketball. If you fancy yourself a fan of the old ABA, for example, 2 great books on the great Julius Erving that might be worth using your credit for. One, of course, is the Rise and Rise of Julius Erving. It's called Doc, and it's written by Vincent Milazzi and narrated by David Cromet. You could use your credit for that book, and it's a great sort of interview style background on the life and times of Dr. J from all sides. But if that's not good enough for you, why not try the autobiography? It's called Dr. J, the Autobiography, of course. It's written by Dr. J in concert with Carl Greenfeld. And it's narrated by Dr. J himself, Julius Erving. And you could use your credit for that book, as well as, like I said, thousands and thousands of other books, not just only in basketball and basketball history, but in a whole host of genres and topics. By all means, give them a try. Why don't you? It's risk-free, for God's sakes. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Yes, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the link. And that's where you're going to get your free audiobook download. Again, you can cancel at any time. And once you do download that book for free, and after you cancel it, if you choose to do that, it's yours to keep. So you can enjoy in perpetuity, for as long as your device lives, the downloaded book free and gratis, courtesy of yours truly here at Good Seats Still Available and our friends at Audible. Thank you, Audible. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you joining our conversation once again. What sort of turns the tide towards the idea of actually taking a strike action versus letting the further legal process play out? Was it Garvey that kind of sort of said, let's get moving on this? Or, was there an event or some other thing looming out there that kind of hastened maybe a more dramatic action by the players? I
think there was an event in early 79 that started to get the players nervous, and Garvey as well, that the owners were not simply sitting by and letting the process play itself out, but rather were trying to be a little more aggressive and weaken the union. And that was in 1979. In January of 79, the U.S. Department of Labor received a request from the North American Soccer League for 246 working visas, which was one more than what had been requested in 1978. But what the players were concerned about was not only were they seeking an extra visa, but the year before, in 1978, a grand total of 476 players had used those available 245 visas because they could be shared. And the players and Garvey saw the request for the extra, for the one additional, but in the players' eyes, nevertheless excessive amount of visas, as an attempt to basically flood the league with these transient foreigners who would never have any vested interest in the union, and as a result would keep player salaries down and weaken the union's bargaining strength when they finally did get to the table. The players' union fought back against that, filed challenges with the Department of Labor, pointing out things that, look, you're not supposed to issue these working visas if U.S. workers can be hurt. It's funny, parenthetically, an issue that helped kill the very first pro soccer league in this country in 1894, when the Baltimore team brought over a bunch of foreigners to represent the Baltimore Orioles in that league. And you can't do that when there's people here, Americans or resident aliens who are available to do the work. You can't bring in contract players. And that's what the NASLPA had told the Department of Labor. It's like, look, you got to cut back on these visas. We have people here who can play. And they won. They won in the sense that the Department of Labor agreed to cut the number of available visas down to 220, but more important, say that a visa could not be reused unless the first player using it was either injured or quit the club voluntarily and left the country, as opposed to being cut. So the players' union not only head off at the pass, what they perceived to be a challenge by the owners to weaken their status, they were successful. And I think that success emboldened them to say, hey, look, if we can do this, maybe it's time let's see if we can cut the legal process short and force the owners to come to the table. Interestingly, by the way, as a result of those actions, two players, Kevin Keelan, the goalkeeper for the New England T-Men,
sure, the Cat,
and David Robb, and the Cat, who was one of my favorite players, and David Robb, who would wind up a month or so later joining the Philadelphia Furies and becoming one of my favorite players, filed charges against the union with the NORB because, among the other things, unions can't discriminate against its members either. So they filed charges with the NRB complaining about this tactic, and those charges were ultimately dismissed in what was a footnote. But, I mean, you can see, suddenly, more litigation. But so it's January 79. The players were successful in beating back what they saw as visa flooding. And I think they were not only getting impatient, not only kind of bothered that the owners would try the stunt in the first place, but having been successful, they figured, hey, we flexed our muscles. We got somewhere. Maybe we should flex our muscles again. Let's start saying the S word. Let's strike.
Naive question. Were or could foreign players be part of the Players Association if they were using visas to play? Could they or could they not be part of a collective bargaining entity?
They could be part of the collective bargaining entity because they're permanent. They're not casual. The concept of appropriate bargaining unit, presumptively, it's full-time and regular part-time. And basically, it's a pretty low bar. I mean, if you're there for any kind of set period with any kind of expected regularity, you're going to be included in the bargaining unit. That includes seasonal workers, like if you're working in a candy factory, and every Easter and every Valentine's Day, I wind up doubling my payroll to meet demands, and those same people keep coming back, even though that's the only two times a year they might be working. They are nevertheless allowed to participate in the bargaining unit. So, yeah, foreigners who are playing in the league would be covered by the collective bargaining agreement and could be represented. Where the foreign status becomes an issue, and it was one of the major issues in what kept the strike from being successful, is while you could be a part of the unit, there's some question as to whether you can actually participate in any kind of a job action. And that was an issue that wouldn't rear its head until a couple months later.
Yeah, that's what I was basically trying to tease out. Sort of is sort of the I'm trying to get a sense of the true stake that some of these foreign players basically being loaned, using obviously a work visa to play during the course of the summer before they went back to their other leagues in Europe or South America. It almost feels to me like that sort of group of player nominally has an interest in seeing sort of the players generally succeed, and the health of the league obviously is part of their ostensible livelihoods. But it's also, I could see them being removed from really care from this because it's they're not really as affected as sort of the rank and file, shall we say, underrepresented American or North American player. whose seems to be not as comparable, I guess, at least in terms of pay and hence maybe the idea of unionization in the first place.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's sort of the conundrum that the NASLPA found itself in then, and to a point, the MLSPU is finding itself in now, as its contract expires at the end of this year, and they may have to confront similar issues. While an argument can be made that these foreign loan players don't share a community of interest with the rest of the bargain unit and they should be excluded, you can make that argument, and as a result, leave yourself with a union that's fairly solid. There's a danger there. There's a danger in that you're excluding a big group of players who make up your league, and indeed, in the NASL was a backbone, although the loan system had really kind of dried up, with the exception of some really big ticket players. Nevertheless, that type of player remained the backbone of your league, that you'd kind of leave yourself with a minority union. I mean, you'd never get anywhere because you're bargaining on behalf of, 1/3 of the actual players in the league, and everyone else is foreign, not part of your union, not covered by the contract, and not someone you can turn to when it is time to strike. You're left with a situation where only 1/3 of the people aren't showing up. And even though the names changed, it was still tough. There was some degree of regularity. I mean, for instance, Trevor Francis did come over 2 years in a row. Alan Ball came over 2 years in a row with the same teams. So that's in that scenario, the NLRB would probably say that those players belong. They share a community of interest. I mean, they're here regularly in the summertime playing in your league. They have an interest in pension. They have an interest in minimum salaries, health care, things like that. You can't exclude them because the board does not want proliferation of units. You can't have a foreign player union and a domestic player union. I mean, so you're kind of stuck with them. You can't exclude them from the unit, but then you run into the real logistical problems that indeed the NASLPA had to confront in '79, and I suspect the MLS union will have to confront if they ever decide the time is right to take a job action next year.
Yeah, and that's especially interesting because this, I guess, is I guess to sort of the more classic American sports fan, right, is kind of lost on them in that perhaps maybe with the exception of the NHL, right, but arguably, soccer, right, is much more of a world sport in terms of talent from many parts of the globe, right, where whereas things like in baseball or in American football, right, you've got these players are really much more commonly aligned in terms of skill set, in terms of player pool and talent, and those kinds of issues. So interestingly, it's certainly not a parallel, let's say, to what maybe Garvey was able to do in the NFL. Right.
I mean, even using your NHL example, and I think today we can even include the NBA, even though those two sports are much more international now, they still, in this country, the NHL and the NBA still have the advantage of being the premier league in the world. So even though those are worldwide games, the best players in the world want to come here and want to stay here. Soccer, the NASL in the 70s and MLS today does not share that distinction. A lot of players will be more than happy and get paid just as much somewhere else. So that lack of permanency makes it tough to get foreign players to keep their eyes on the ball on issues that are of concern to the players who are more permanent here. So right, that's obviously not only foreign in the general work sense. A teamster working in a production and maintenance unit at, say, Coca-Cola doesn't have to address these issues, and even an athlete, as you've already pointed out, in baseball, football, certainly in the 70s, these weren't issues that had to be confronted. They were unique to soccer. Like so much of soccer, it's very unique because of its worldwide status. A lot of the American, I guess for want of a better way to describe it, the American templates we expect to fit don't always necessarily work with soccer, and that was clearly the case here in '79.
Yeah, that's a huge distinction. That idea that the NASL is obviously not the quote unquote world's best league in the sport, right? Which is much more of a worldly endeavor versus the best of the world in a form of like a Major League Baseball or an NFL football. So that's a very interesting sort of twin set of issues that maybe gets us to our next point, which is kind of where the, I guess, real action and hijinks really come into play, right? So we're now into late March of 1979 when Mr. Garvey and friends basically set in motion the concept, the vote of a potential strike, which is, just to put it all into context, right, is around sort of the late part of the preseason and first, I think, week of the actual regular season for the NASL in 1979. What were some of the specifics around sort of that? And the next couple of weeks, which is when things really got ugly and then, shall we say, sideways?
Yeah, ugly, sideways, chaotic. Initially, the players, John Kerr, Garvey, they were saying, look, we're going to go on strike. We're setting a March 31st deadline. If the league is not at the table bargaining with us by March 31st, the players are then going to entertain a strike vote. And again, the players are saying all along, look, this isn't about money. We're not threatening a strike to try to get more money. This is simply, they kept saying, we want to be recognized, which is, again, poor choice of words. They were already recognized. But they said, we just want to get the club owners in the league to the table so we could start bargaining. The league kept saying, no, we're not meeting with you. And so the March 31st deadline came and went. At that point, the players, at that point, there's numbers are being leaked to the media that, early accounts of the players are leaning 3-1 towards striking. Again, whether that was just a trial balloon to see if it would get the owner's attention is anyone's guess. But ultimately, the players voted in early April, by a pretty large margin, 252 to 113 to strike. The owners continued to ignore the demands to go to the table. So on Friday the 13th, appropriately enough, the players said they were going on strike. The problem, and whether you're a truck driver, a carpenter, or a professional soccer player, there's always that long drink of water between saying I'm going on strike and actually going on strike. And in the end, the NASL Players Association found out, much to its chagrin, that players had much more enthusiasm for talking about a strike than actually doing it. That opening weekend, some teams had pretty much the entire roster decide to go on strike. Some teams, no one went on strike. Some teams, only one or two people went on strike. And so it was chaos. And along with the chaos, some humor, some tragedy, but it was a mess. And again, which is typical in situations like this. Anytime you have players crossing the line, we're on strike. We voted for a strike. I don't care if you didn't vote for it. When the body votes for a strike, you're supposed to strike. You don't cross the line. And you had many players, star players, crossing the line. It resulted in player against player. It was a mess. But that weekend, again, some comedy, some tragedy, but you had situations like Chicago. Chicago Sting voted 19-0 against the strike. And, they had a normal game. They played against Vancouver, who was a Canadian team, was not part of the bargaining unit, and was prohibited by Canadian law from striking anyway. So they had a regular game. But then you have, and then Tampa Bay, who also voted against the strike, played against the full-strength Toronto. But then you get Philadelphia. Philadelphia Fury voted unanimously against the strike, went up against the New England T-Men, who had 10 regulars go out on strike. So they're playing with backups and people they can pull off the street. Washington had three people strike, so they had mostly a full lineup. The Fort Lauderdale Strikers lived up to their name. 16 of them went out on strike, and they were grabbing anyone they could find. They had two brothers share goalkeeping duties, and I think they were accountants during the day. I won't go line by line, but to give you another example of just how or game by game. But two more examples, I guess. Memphis only had one player show up, and I won't mention his name. Why would I want to honor his scab, right? But he was a foreign player. He was the only one that showed up. His agent played goal that night for Memphis against the Detroit Express, who took advantage of playing against the team of replacements. An American named Bob Rohrbach had a 4-goal game. I don't think he scored a goal after that. So it was a mess. And one of the biggest messes was with the Cosmos. The Cosmos initially voted 20-2 to strike, and that was important because, the Cosmos were the flagship franchise in that league, and I think other players looked to see, the other players around the league looked to see what the Cosmos were doing, and initially the Cosmos voted 20-2 to strike. As it turned out, most of them had a change of heart and went to the game anyway. 14 regulars went to play Atlanta. Bobby Smith, Warner Roth, Gary Etherington, and one or two others were among the few who didn't go, but rather infamously, because it was reported in the papers at the time, Bobby Smith is screaming at the bus, trying to convince his teammates, don't go. He's in tears, according to some reports. But they went. And indeed, other from what I've seen from press reports, other teams were calling and asking, is Beckenbauer playing? I guess if he honored the line, some other players would have also decided not to play. But he played, and you just saw the strike dying on the vine. There were lots of reasons for it, but one of the big reasons was a lot of the foreign players really didn't know where they stood. Some foreign players didn't play because they were afraid if they were strike breakers, they were going to get deported, because federal law was you couldn't bring in foreign players to replace workers who were striking. So they're afraid, well, if I play, I'm going to be deported. So they sat out even though they really didn't want to. Other players played because they're afraid, well, if I participate in a strike, I'm going to get sent home. So it was particularly awkward for a league that was still the large majority of which was foreign, that the players didn't know where they stood. The players' union was saying what they wanted them to hear because they wanted support. The owners were telling them something else because they wanted them to play. It was a mess. So that weekend was utter chaos. But it can be fairly said that the strike was a disaster. I think ultimately a grand total of 143 players, less than 1/3 of the entire league, actually struck.
Why was the participation rate in this strike so widely varied by team, right? Because the effect of foreign players in the league was widespread in the league, right? It was fairly quote unquote evenly distributed, but I mean, to go, why unanimous against in Chicago, say, versus almost universally for, albeit not fully played out, say in New York. Right? It just seems like these are completely wildly different, non-uniform results, I guess, in terms of whether to strike or not to strike.
Yeah, that's a good question. And
no resolve, it seems.
Yeah, well, based on practical experience that I see today, my best guess would have to be that it would depend on the quality of the player rep. I mean, Garvey couldn't be at 24 places at all times. Each of these teams had a player representative, a shop steward, if you will. And I think a lot of it might come to the personal charm and charisma of the player rep, able to persuade his teammates to follow along. Some of it may be cultural. For instance, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, largely English presence. The concept of unionization was not a foreign one to English players. They'd seen the value of the English Players Union in busting the maximum wage and things like that. There was some homogeneity there. I mean, it was largely English. I mean, not coincidentally, one of the few regulars for the Strikers who busted the strike was Teofilo Cubillas from Peru, for whom unionization, he wasn't English, and unionization may have been a difficult concept for him to swallow, as opposed to Chicago, largely German at that point, And while the Germans are not anti-union as a people, they've had great success with it. Again, it just might be, hey, we feel loyal to Willie Roy. We feel, whatever. Certain teams are treated better than others. I think Lee Stern, Chicago being a good example. Lee Stern was good to his players. Conversely, the Robbie family, who owned the Strikers, while they may not have been bad to the players per se, I think they treated them well. The Robbies were one of the main villains. The Hunts and the Robbies were seen as the two big villains in this piece, who were fighting hard against unionization. So maybe the Strikers players felt much more strongly about it. As far as the Cosmos, I couldn't tell you what happened. Again, the initial vote was 20-2. Only 2 people voted against the strike. The infamous class act Giorgio Chinaglia was one of them. But nevertheless, when it was time to actually walk the line, 14 regulars changed their mind and went. What was that? Was Bobby Smith too strident? And he turned some people off? I mean, that's just a pure guess. I'm not going to say anything bad about Mr. Smith, but a pure guess. I know I was reading some reports. None of the Dallas players struck, but Steve Petcher, an American player, said, look, we got all the facts, and they really appreciated the work of their player rep, a guy named George Lay, because he said he came here and he was just very factual. He didn't repeat anti-owner propaganda. He didn't badmouth the union. He just told us factually what was going on, and under those circumstances, we didn't think the time was right. And with the benefit of hindsight, I have to say, I'll put on my labor lawyer hat. I have to say that while there's a certain value to wanting to flex your muscle, with the benefit of hindsight, I'd have to say it was really a dumb move, a short-sighted move, to play the strike card over something you already had. I mean, you may have been impatient with the process, but the process is the process. So going on strike to try to force the owners to give up their legal right to appeal it was just not the type of thing you want to lay your cards on the table for, because what you have is what you had here. You had a bunch of players who didn't feel that strongly about it. It's not like you were fighting for wages. It wasn't like you were fighting for a pension, something like, hey, they won't even give us a pension. That's outrageous. You're fighting over the right to be talked to. You already had that right. You were just waiting for the board and the courts to affirm that. It was a strange move. It was a strange move. By the way, before I forget, one other, like with Philadelphia voting 19-0, the situation there, it might be attributable to the fact that the Fury cut the player rep. He was a third string goalkeeper named David Bragg, but he got cut. So in a situation like that, you're like, oh, maybe the players got scared. They said, hey, our union rep got cut. The union could do nothing for him. Why are we going to go on strike? So there's lots of different things that come into play there. But I think ultimately it may have come to, for a lot of these players, the issue of going on strike, so we'll be talked to. When we already had that right, we're just waiting to enforce it, didn't seem the type of thing worth going out over. And indeed, to finish that thought, I guess the bitter irony, we'll talk about how the union tried to keep the strike going, but I'll just give you a timeline. The strike was finally called off on April 18th for reasons we'll talk about in a second. Less than 2 weeks later, guess what? The board finally issued its order finding that the unit was appropriate and the NASL violated law by refusing the bargain, which took it to the next step, which got it in the federal court, which was going to be the final step anyway. So again, they struck, and for what? 2 weeks later, they got the answer they were looking for anyway.
That said, did the strike action hasten the board's decision, or was that completely separate from this? I guess the point is that, I mean, was there a Pyrrhic victory? Well, I don't know if it's Pyrrhic, but did it nudge things along faster, this albeit ill-fated strike?
I can answer as a former board employee. Officially, probably not. It's not like because there was a strike, suddenly President Carter is picking up the phone and yelling at the board to get the decision out. However, practically speaking, given the fact that there was a weekend with a work stoppage, it might have had the effect of prompting the board to finally get the decision out. But it's impossible to say. But it's important to remember, the union was going to continue to strike. I mean, even though that first weekend was a disaster, both sides were kind of pointing at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. the players' union was saying, well, we didn't get enough support because these players are afraid they're going to get sent home if they honor the strike line. The owners are saying you're going to get sent home if you go on strike, and they were waiting for some guidance from INS. So to give you a timeline, April 15 was the weekend of the strike. It's a disaster. April 16, Garvey, in what's probably, he's scrambling now, face-saving mode, makes this offer. Look, he offers the league, look, I will give you a no-strike clause. We will not strike even if we don't reach terms on an agreement. We will not strike if you agree to meet with us. If you agree to start bargaining with us, we'll give you a promise we won't strike over economic terms. The league still said no. April 17, the next day, Garvey, Kerr, handful of reps from some of the stronger teams like the Strikers, meet with the Cosmos to try to convince the Cosmos to go out on strike because they recognize what the Cosmos do, the rest of the league will follow. The Cosmos, again, demur. They're like, no, we're not going to go on strike. And then finally, that same day, INS rules that, look, players on a current visa will not be deported if they play during the strike. Well, with that,
all the leverage is gone.
Yeah, right. Garvey's non-American support, non-North American player support goes out the window because, as it turns out, I guess of the 143 players who struck, those who were foreign, they didn't strike because they wanted to. They struck because they felt they had to. And I want to make a key distinction. I'm sure that doesn't include people like Ray Hudson, who was a strong union man and was all in, but some of these other players, they were probably out because they thought they had to be out, and they were welcoming the opportunity to go back to work. So, right, Garvey at that point was looking at an Americans-only strike, and at that stage, Americans weren't getting a whole lot of minutes in that league. When your bench goes on strike, who's going to notice? It was pointless. So Garvey called the strike off on the 18th of April.
So what sort of came out of all this? Because clearly the debate, the conversation, the consternation was still very, very much still wending its way through the courts. And I guess it wasn't even settled until, frankly, it was too late by 1984 in terms of all of that. But it also feels to me that, it kind of got forgotten, at least, on some levels, fairly quickly because the league, continued on its way in 79 and 80, arguably to some great success. I mean, was there any retribution? I mean, it's pretty clear based on our conversation with Bobby Smith, I think, that the reason why he left the Cosmos in 79, I don't think was of his own volition. And I think an argument could be made that because of his leadership from the union side of things in the Cosmos clubhouse, that he was kind of, at least in management's eyes, persona non grata as 79 wore on. But that seems to be more, unless I'm missing something, more the exception rather than the rule, or was there other repercussions to players who are more vocal as well, as you could tell?
Well, there were two things. There were definitely player repercussions, and I'm going to mention some names that will really surprise you. But I think there's another factor. While all this is pending, as a matter of law, the NASL is supposed to maintain the status quo. Again, they can't make changes to working conditions. And one, even though this effect was pre-strike, one thing that the president of the union had a real hand in hamstringing the league on was plans to have an indoor league in 78, 79 to directly challenge the brand new major indoor soccer league had to be put on hold because starting an indoor league would be a unilateral change, which would generate unfair labor practice charges, and it was something that the league really didn't want. So in 78, 79, and probably they were hoping, hey, this will go away by next year, they took a pass, and as a result, gave the ground floor to the MISL. And you had Mr. Ed Tepper. You had Mr. Ed Tepper on just a couple of weeks ago, sort of pointing out, we had it all to ourselves. It was a huge advantage. Things like that wound up being body blows to the league that they may not have seen the bruising right away, but it became problematic. But going back to the players, going back to your main question, Bobby Smith he absolutely was. He got traded from the Cosmos, and I don't think there's any doubt that it was it was in retaliation for his union activities. I already mentioned Dave Bragg, who, again, third-string goalkeeper, but nevertheless, Dave Bragg is given his walking papers even before the strike by the Philadelphia Fury. There was, but Bobby Smith's a Hall of Famer. There's two other Hall of Famers. Al Trost, who was known as Captain America at the time. He was pre-Ricky Davis. He was probably the most visible and best American-born player in the league. He starred with the St. Louis Stars. He moved out to California in '78 when that franchise became the California Surf. He was that team's union rep. After the '79 season, future Hall of Famer Al Trost is traded to the Seattle Sounders for the Seattle Sounders player representative, a Canadian Hall of Famer, goalkeeper Tony Chersky. Both of those players were out of the league after the 1980 season. Al Trost, the Hall of Famer, out of the league after that season. Chet Messing, who was one of the few players in Rochester who went on strike, finished the '79 season and never played an outdoor game again. And part of that might have been Shep's preference to play indoor. He was sort of all in with the New York Arrows and helping that league start out. But, money's money, and being active is being active. I find it hard to believe that a goalkeeper of Shep's caliber, who statistically he was the league's all-time best if you look at save percentage, couldn't find work. 80, 81, 82, 83. He's still playing indoor. Unless you have to consider that there was a fair amount of blackballing going on. And because the league was getting nasty, because after the strike, the league basically stopped with its practices. Okay, we're gonna hold the status quo. They start making changes. They start making changes in early February of 1980, which is really what brought this to a head. In early 1980, they start, actually, I shouldn't say early 1980. In '79, after the strike is broken, the league starts feeling emboldened. And that's always the problem when you take a swing and miss. As the saying goes, if you're going to shoot at the king, make sure you kill him. The players missed. So the league starts flexing its muscles. In March of '79, they start doing things like now requiring the players to get approval from the team if they want to wear a different brand of shoes than what the team's endorsing. They announced they're going to do indoor soccer in '79-80, whether the players like it or not. They announced a plan to increase the schedule by 2 games in 1980. Plans to reduce roster size. Again, the type of thing, you're going to take jobs away. The type of thing that's going to hurt the union. From 30 to 26. They start negotiating with players out of contract directly, which you can't do when there's a union. Even in the world of sports, where most of your contracts are ultimately individual when you're talking about salaries. This leads to a series of new unfair labor practice charges being filed by the union against the league, that this time results in the National Labor Relations Board seeking injunctive relief. At this point, the board finally decides to start flexing its muscle and says, we're going to put a stop to this. The NASL is flagrantly violating the law. Understand why this is going on. The March 21st of 1980, a district court denies the test of cert case. Basically, the final word is issued that the unit's appropriate. Actually, the final word issued on October 14th of 1980, when the U.S. Supreme Court denied review. Meanwhile, in August of 1980, the Players Union gets an injunction ordering the league to sit down and bargain, restore the status quo, overturn all those individually negotiated contracts, and start bargaining. And October 3rd, 1980, the appeal of the injunction was denied. So you're looking at October 3rd, 1980, the appeal of the injunction is denied. October 14, 1980, the Supreme Court denies certiorari of denies review. That's a legal term for review, discretionary review. Won't review the test of cert. So October 14, 1980, 3 years and a couple months after this all started, it's finally done. The league has to sit and bargain with the union. So, but along the way, again, players with 3 Hall of Famers who are run out of the league. Messing should be in the Hall of Fame. He's run out of the league. The divide between the native player and the foreign player grows. There's bad blood. It was a mess all around. And then the sad capstone to all this, I guess, is that having fought for over 3 years to keep the union out, when the parties finally get to the table, the league basically lies on its back and lets its belly get tickled. It gave the shop away, which was a big contributor towards the ultimate demise of the league.
All right. Well, so let's maybe sort of round the curve with that sort of thought, right? So, there are some people out there that sort of say that that the strike and the things before, during, and frankly, the pieces of it afterwards was a contributing factor to the league's ultimate collapse. Now, that sounds a little facile and a little sort of naive to sort of think that was sort of the foundational issue, but I got to think that was part of the bigger tableau of issues and obviously some of the others. But I guess I would reframe the question then is, how much do you think that this labor strife, and it seems to me you could make the argument that by the time the league collapsed in 84, early 85, some of these basic issues that were fighting over those years were never really fully solved.
No, they weren't. And I guess, I don't think the actual strike was just an itch to be scratched. I mean, that was no big deal. But I think where the league was hurt by the presence of the players' union was, again, in that over 3-year period, starting in August of 77, where, as a matter of law, the league is obligated to maintain the status quo. They can't make changes without bargaining. That even during that growth period, I mean, they had the big growth in 78, but if they saw in 79 and going into 80, tweaks that needed to be made, if they were able to see cracks in the firmament that said, all right, this is spinning a bit out of control, maybe we do need to reduce roster size, maybe we do need to reduce minimum salaries, maybe we have to make some changes to cut some costs to remain viable, they weren't in a position to do it. If indoor soccer was a revenue stream that was worth being exploited, they missed a prime opportunity to do it on the ground floor when the league felt it had to take a pass on starting its season in 78, 79 because of the labor strike. We won't know what the league wanted to do. And we have some idea. Again, I mentioned they were trying to reduce roster size and things like that. But if there were other things that could have been addressed, and the league wasn't able to, if there was certain bleeding that the league wasn't able to staunch because of its obligation to maintain the status quo, the presence of the union would have certainly hurt there. Ultimately, the contract that was agreed to, while not excessive, certainly not by today's standards, what we see with contracts, nevertheless, did include provisions that was too much too soon. Some examples, there was a 25% increase in minimum salaries in 1980. They finally got a contract, December 5th, 1980. After all that fighting, it basically took 4 all-night bargaining sessions to get a contract. It included a 25% wage increase in minimum salaries. It guaranteed contracts. It didn't have instant free agency, but it had built-in escalators, kind of like a watered-down version of a franchise tag. Actually, not even that, because it was automatic. The players basically agreed to a 3-year reserve clause. The first year, the option year, was an automatic 10% raise. The second year was an automatic 7.5% raise, and then you were free the third year. Players got a piece of waiver money. You got a 10% relocation bonus if you were traded or waived mid-season. These were costs that, in hindsight, the league was ill-prepared to handle. And of course, and we now see, it wasn't all the players' fault. Anyone who's studied the league now knows what a disaster the rapid expansion in 1978 was when you had so many weak sister franchises already around, dragging the league down. The NASL was bleeding from a lot of different places, but the union kind of accelerated it. But lest we forget, there is one good thing about having a collective bargaining agreement, and that is when there's a labor organization, there are certain exemptions from antitrust concepts. And one thing that's a violation of antitrust law is a salary cap, because it's a limit on competition. And so that's why every time the NBA goes out of contract, the players threaten to decertify, because they know if they decertify, the contract goes out the door, and now the salary cap's illegal. Well, when Howard Samuels took over the league from Phil Woosnam and tried to fix some of these things, in 1984, he was able to institute the salary cap because of the presence of the union, because he had a collective bargaining agreement. If the union wasn't there, you couldn't do that, and the league probably would have died a year earlier. Okay, now that's not much of a victory, but unions aren't always bad. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I'm a labor attorney. Unions aren't always bad. If you work with them, they can be your partners. Here, everyone, I mean, probably you could say from the very formation of the union in 77 through the contract being entered into in 1980, I think both sides thought the sport was a lot healthier than it really was. And as a result, everyone spent too much too soon. And indeed, I think we could say the same thing about the MISL, where Earl Foreman did not have a contentious relationship with the union. He wanted a union. He wanted to set some of these parameters right away. Nevertheless, both sides, just their eyes are bigger than their stomachs, as the saying goes. They both sides spent too much too soon. And yeah, ultimately the presence of the union was absolutely a contributing factor to the demise of the North American Soccer League.
All right, last question. How do we juxtapose this with what is or might, again, transpire in Major League Soccer? Some differences, of course, right? Major League Soccer is still a single entity business. It is obviously gotten quite big, lots of interesting revenue streams and soccer-specific stadiums and all that kind of stuff. But, it seems to me that some of this, everything old is new again. When it comes to things like player salaries and rights to move back and forth between franchises or be able to negotiate their contracts in an appropriate manner. What do you think, sort of, if you have to look at your crystal ball, anything similar or dissimilar this time around, maybe in the next year or two, as MLS and their players perhaps come to loggerheads again?
I think the big similarity is going to be that you have a union, the MLS union, that really feels the need to flex its muscles this time. And I think there was a feeling that they kind of got deep pantsed with the last contract. They settled for a pretty watered down version of free agency, and the league kind of rubbed it in their face when halfway through the season, after the contract was settled, the concept of targeted allocation money suddenly came out. I mean, the owners were basically bragging, we had all this money set aside because we thought you were going to fight a little harder. Well, now we're going to spend it. So I think, as in 1979, you have a players' union that feels it's got to flex its muscle. You've got a players' union that thinks that, with probably, in fairness, much greater reason to than the NASL players' union did, that this is a league that is thriving. This isn't a Ponzi scheme in the sense that, hey, 79's good. They still have all the money from the 6 expansion teams. No one folded. Everything's good. MLS is in a much different territory, as you've already pointed out. I mean, it's just many more revenue streams. They own their stadiums, what have you, that the money's there. The key lesson that the MLSPU needs to learn from the NASLPA and the strike is that, not all of your members feel as strongly about the issues as the leaders may. You have the foreign player problem. And now it's not so much the lone player, the transient element. Now it's a problem in that what's important to an American player, increasing the minimum salary and getting free agency, may not be as important to the Caribbean player or African player for whom this salary is a king's ransom, is much greater than anything they're going to get at home. And they know they're not good enough to play in Europe. How do you incentivize a player like that to walk the line and make common cause with his American counterparts? It can be done. I mean, that's where good union leadership comes into play, where you're able to say, look, big picture, guys, this is going to help you. Yeah, I know this is more money than you'll ever see, and you think it's crazy. Why would you walk? But you'll not only get more money, but you might get a pension. You might do that. I mean, there's there's always salesmanship involved in any strike. I mean, there's never 100% support for any strike in any industry. There's always a fair amount of persuasion, a fair amount of advocacy that has to be done. And I think the MLS Players Union, if it's intent on striking, if it doesn't get what it wants, and I do think this timeout that's really going to be filling, they need to pay close attention to the lessons that the NASLPA learned in '79 and make sure they have true support to walk out, not just people willing to raise their hands and say, yeah, I'll do it, but that when the time comes, they are going to walk the line and not go to work. And that's always difficult. But I think history has shown that the NLSPU has its work cut out for it if that's the path it decides to go down.
I think that's especially interesting because then you're going to start to see some narrative shaping, right? Because MLS at once likes to tout how successful it is. It's getting, on the march to 28 franchises and soccer-specific stadiums and all that kind of stuff. And yet, when it's convenient, you sort of hear Commissioner Garvey and others sort of talk about how they're still in investment mode and they're not, there's not a whole lot of profitability yet, and all these kinds of other sort of side issues and stuff. So the truth obviously is somewhere in between those two things. But it would seem to me, right, that given, almost, it's 25 plus years now of, or 20 plus years of, or 30 years, 1996. So let's do the math. A lot of years Major League Soccer has spent, building up a foundation. It seems that's a lot more stable and frankly, probably a bigger target that any players union will have a much wider array, I guess, of things to nibble at with some kind of union action. So it'll be very interesting to see sort of what transpires in the next year or two for sure. Yeah,
I mean, as you point out, every league cries poor when the time comes. I mean, they because every employer does that too. No employer says, "Yeah, I got lots of money. How much of it do you want?" They all cry poor. And as opposed to the 70s, I mean, these leagues have learned how to fight back. NFL and the NFL and the NBA is pretty much thumped their unions the last few contract cycles. The NHL has not had as much success because the NHL Players Union is just they're just better suited to withstand lockouts as opposed to the other two leagues where careers are shorter. I mean, I'm not going to beat up on the players. There's much different factors involved. And, by all counts, baseball is about to run into some labor strike. I mean, the players are in strife. The players are itching for a strike. So whether MLB finally wins one remains to be seen because that's a league that's always been beaten up by its union. So it's not like it was in the 70s where everyone was so afraid of a strike that in the end, the players always came out ahead. Owners know how to fight back. MLS has the advantage, as you pointed out, it's single entity. As opposed to those other leagues, they don't have to fear the absence of a collective bargaining agreement or a decertification because they're a single entity. They've already bitten the antitrust bullet and survived. And one would hope, and again, I say this as a labor attorney, I would still hope that the union recognizes that, again, you're not the NFL. You're not the NBA. All those factors that came into play in '79 that we discussed, it's a worldwide market. Players have plenty of places to play other than MLS. That by all means, get what you can get. But, I really hope you don't, wind up really dealing a fatal blow to the league in the process because even with the soccer-specific stadiums and everything else, you just get the feeling that some of these owners would be more than happy just to close up shop and take the tax write-off if that time came. I mean, 2002 was a different era, as we know, but it was pre-Beckham and everything else. But, the bankruptcy papers were drawn up. They had no problems almost cashing it in, not that long ago. I'd hate to see anyone give them the opportunity to think about going down that road again.
Look, as a fan, I remember this strike, but I will tell you that, we were also in a time then in '79 where information was much harder to come by, right? It wasn't like we had internet and all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of like what you could sort of divine in the agate of your local newspaper. And I had the ability to sort of be in the New York area. So we had a little bit maybe more than most. And then maybe Soccer America the week or two afterwards. And that was kind of it. It wasn't a whole lot of, a real nuanced conversation or discussion about sort of, this strike thing. And maybe because I was a kid at the time, right? But, I think there was probably a little bit of, I would call it naivete, but I think most fans it didn't even register on their collective brains, right? They just were still, some were just becoming still enamored with the sport, and then obviously the crowds were still growing at that point. So it's funny.
It's funny. I was a little different. I was 14 at the time, but I lived in a union household. My father was he was president of a local union, and so and I was a big soccer guy even then. So I was watching it much more intently because it was just like, whoa, strike, kids! These guys are going to do like what my dad does. I mean, he only went out on strike once, like 15 years earlier. But this is, I'm gonna watch this, and you're right. I mean, other than Soccer America, the Philly papers didn't really talk about it much. Again, none of the Fury struck. I do remember seeing like the capsule summaries, and it mentioned that everyone went out on this team, but no one went out on that team. I was able to see it wasn't much of a strike, as opposed to what I remember the baseball strike and the football strike. Where you knew, it was on the news, and you saw people with pickets. I mean, apparently only the California Surf, they were the only team that actually bothered walking around with picket signs. But even then I was paying attention to it because, the future labor lawyer. I mean, I didn't think I wanted to be a lawyer at the time. I wanted to be a pro soccer player, but, labor law was in my house. And even my dad, who didn't care much about soccer, was paying attention because any time workers were trying to do something, he was all in. And I remember being disappointed that the strike failed. Because not that I wanted to see the league fail, but even at that age, it was the union person in me thought, well, that's too bad. I mean, these players went to do something and they did a really bad job at it, and now this is what we have. So it registered with me then.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for, because it seems like this exercise may wind up becoming newly interesting to a bunch of people maybe the next year or two as MLS sort of crosses their next bridge. So not that we're wishing that to happen, but I don't know, as the increasingly casual MLS observer, which is saying something, you wonder what's next on that horizon. It seems inevitable that there will be some kind of something in short order that recalibrates that story for the next couple of years, right?
Yeah, but as you saw with the World Football League, I mean, it would be interesting to see whether, if there was a strike, whether someone will then decide to take that opportunity to finally jumpstart a genuine rival league that, whether it has pro rel or otherwise, that is perhaps a bit more aggressive than MLS, because there'll be availability of players. If I'm on strike, then you go play for someone else. Which is why hockey, it's one of the reasons why hockey always falls apart, because a lot of those guys are more than happy to go home to Europe and pick up a paycheck while they're on strike. Will someone decide, hey, there's labor strife, here's the opportunity, again, just like the WFL, here's the opportunity to grab some good players, and we're going to form this pro-rel league, and we'll see if where the American soccer public falls. So, because again, historically, we've seen the only thing that generates change for the better in sports in this country is a rival league, whether it's the AFL, ABA, WHA, whatever. It's going back to 1901, the American League actually helped save baseball because it cleaned it up. At some point, we need to have a rival here. Someone's got to challenge MLS supremacy. I know it's a little harder with the USSF and FIFA. I think the NASL had its opportunity in 15, and then they dropped the ball. And they brought they should have gone the antitrust route then, when the Division I standards were suddenly going to be doubled right before they applied for it, as opposed to waiting until they were fighting over whether they were D2 or not. But someone's got to make that challenge, I think, to finally push the sport to the next level here, because I think it's too far gone. It's never going to fold and go away again. I'm convinced of that. And the strike may help prompt that, interestingly enough. I'm not necessarily rooting for a strike because there's always consequences. We saw it with the NASL. We saw it, in some other leagues. And even box lacrosse, that was more a lockout, but I mean, it's still slowly bouncing back from that. But at the same time, I think MLS is getting a bit too complacent. I think we're seeing the problems. I mean, with the national team, I think a lot of it across the board. USL seems to be lining itself up to be that competitor. It's playing like it's a partner, but between the championship and League One, and now putting teams in Chicago proper, I could see them waking up on one day like the American League did. They were the Western League one day, a minor league, woke up in 1901, announced, oh, we're major now, and there you go. So I'm rambling, so I'll stop it. I think a strike may be a catalyst, might be the first domino in that effect, and we'll be curious to see how that all plays out.
Our thanks once again to Steve Holroyd. And if you remember, Steve was also a previous guest when we were talking about his website called retrolax.com. His other passion, of course, and if you're interested in the history of box lacrosse and frankly lacrosse in general, of the professional variety in particular in the United States, I cannot highly recommend retrolax.com. That's retro, RETROLAX.com enough. It is a true trove of wonderment about all the various little nooks and crannies of the history of pro lacrosse in this country. But of course, if you're interested more in Steve's soccer history stuff, of course, you can check out this article about the NASL strike and a bunch of other things that Steve has written over the years as well at ussoccerhistory.org. That's ussoccerhistory.org. That is the home site of the Society for American Soccer History. And you'll find all kinds of interesting stories and anecdotes there. But again, I think it's a very interesting article and conversation, especially with the knowledge that by the end of the 2019 season of Major League Soccer, we will yet again be looking at another situation where the players and the owners will have differing points of view as to how to relate with each other in the years ahead. And I think you'll see in those proceedings some real interesting statistics and data and stories, frankly, and framings of just how successful or perhaps financially not successful Major League Soccer is, and perhaps how the future of the sport here in the United States on the pro level will look going forward. Lots of things to celebrate over the 20 some odd years of Major League Soccer and lots more still to come. But again, we kind of, look at history as a bit of a framing for what looks to be in the future. And I would argue that not all that glitters is gold right now in not only in professional sports, but professional soccer in particular. Anybody who's gone to an MLS game and has wondered why there are so many empty seats, or has scratched their head as to how a league that was, contracting maybe about 10 years ago could now support upwards of 28 and then some franchises, including a whole bunch of soccer-specific stadiums. It's very interesting to sort of see what the economics of that really are, and maybe how the players and the owners will hopefully successfully coexist in the months and the years to come. So timely is today's headlines, and we always strive to stay timely in those regards. And of course, if you want to check out all of our other episodes, you can, of course, go to goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's our website. And you're going to find all of our hundreds, yeah, we're in the hundreds now. We can say that with credibility of episodes. Plenty of stuff there for you to choose from and find, and across all kinds of sports and teams and leagues. Lots more to come. But that is the best place to keep in touch with us. Again, that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just check us out there early and often. Sign up for our newsletter. Send us some email. And our social media sites, please, by all means, follow us on all those places. On Twitter, you'll find us at goodseatsstill. On Instagram, you'll find us at goodseatsstillavailable. And you'll also find a Facebook page to us. Just whatever means. Feel free to follow us there. And we appreciate you doing so. And we also appreciate our good pal, Jerry Payne, and his friends at Podfly Productions, and we thank him and them for helping us with our production needs each and every week. And if you want to find out more about their production and directorial efforts and all the stuff that they can do to help you get into podcasting, if you're interested, by all means, check them out at podfly.net. I am done. I appreciate. Thank you so much. The ticket window is now closed. Until next week, we'll see you. Bye-bye.